You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Tabloid headlines and newspaper articles cite new evidence that nearly 1 million people are in danger of becoming problem gamblers, and that the huge increase in gambling addicts is set to make Britain's obsession with online betting a £2 billion industry. However, the British Gambling Prevalence Survey hasn't actually been published since 2010, and there won't be another one because the government has cut its funding. Here with me to talk about gambling in the UK is a reformed gambling addict, a professional gambler, a consultant to the gambling industry, a professor of gambling, and a gambling psychologist. So I'm hoping this discussion will shed some light on the headlines and articles we see about the UK's gambling problems. I'm going to come to you first, Professor Mark Griffiths, who's a chartered psychologist and Europe's only professor of gambling studies at Nottingham Trent University.
Well, the good news for Britain is that we've actually got one of the lowest prevalence rates of problem gambling across Europe. Our current prevalence rate is just below 1%. And there's only, I think Sweden is the only country that's got a lower prevalence rate of problem gambling. So on that score, we're doing very well. Obviously, as you just mentioned, we've not had a British Gambling Prevalence Survey. The last one was published in 2011 and took data from 2010. And what we saw in that one was obviously quite a steep increase in the amount of people gambling online. And of course, what remote gambling has done, either gambling through the internet and gambling via mobile phones and interactive television, it's taken gambling out of traditional gambling environments and taken them into the home and the workplace. And of course, that, you can legislate till the cows come home, but at the end of the day, people gambling in their own home, there's not a lot of kind of regulation that can occur in these types of remote forms of gambling. And that, I think in Britain, the rise of remote gambling, plus the increase in the amount of advertising we've seen for gambling. I mean, since the new Gambling Act came into force on September the 1st, 2007, what we can now do is that most forms of gambling can legally advertise on television now. And of course, if I sit down tonight and watch an average night of television programming, I will see that certainly before 10 o'clock, loads of adverts for the lottery and online bingo, usually some sporting adverts if there's a sporting event on, and then after 10:30, loads of adverts for online poker. So I think all of these are contributing to, if you like, the rise of problem gambling across the UK. And what we did see in the last British Gambling Prevalence Survey was an increase of 50% of problem gambling in this country. So there has been a statistically significant increase since the previous survey in 2007.
Thanks, Professor Griffiths. I'm going to ask Jake Brindell, who's a reformed gambling addict. Where did you fit in terms of those statistics that we've just heard?
Well, I've been gambling ever since I was 10 years old. First got addicted at the seaside arcades, and then would play the fruit machines, would seek them out everywhere. I used to call them the bandits, and just sort of progressed through all the levels, gambling on football, then going to the bookmakers and then onto the casinos. And then I would say that my addiction really rocketed when the introduction of the fixed odds betting terminals. You had high stakes. In the beginning, they weren't limited. You could literally bet up to £1,000, £2,000 on a spin. So we had high stakes, not total anonymity, but you could be sitting in a corner in a bookmaker. And yeah, the rapid playing, massive interactivity with high stakes really accelerated my addiction, and sort of it all came crashing down after that. Funnily enough, I've only ever done online poker once. But once was enough, quite frankly. I nearly died that night. I maxed out every card I could get my hands on, £10,000, whilst I was angrily completely out of control. I drank 18 bottles of lager, followed angrily by 2 neat bottles of whiskey in about an hour and a half. Maxed out everything I could, and then you have to stand up and face the enormity of what you've done. You come out of that gambling trance, and the waves of everything that just come crashing over you are so immense.
Was that after the online poker session?
Yes.
So you mentioned the fixed betting terminals that are more dangerous, which Professor Griffiths didn't say. But then the worst night of your life, in your gambling life, was the online poker night. So would you perhaps agree then with Mark Griffiths then that remote gambling on that level in your own home online poses a greater threat to gambling addicts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because, okay, my addiction was always going to spiral out of control in some form. But what the online gaming did, it allowed me to, in a state of complete disrepair or no control, able to just throw as much credit cards that I could. There was no safety net. There was nothing there. There was no protection mechanism to stop me from behaving as I was behaving. So yeah, it was a different form of gambling, because if you're in the arcades, if you're in the bookmakers, you're still in a social environment. You do feel as if, you know, if things were getting so out of control that there are other humans, for example, that are going to maybe step in or help you. You don't have that when you're on your own in my bed, as I was, in a terribly weakened condition, drinking copious amounts of alcohol. That's harsh. And of course, obviously since then I've read so many stories of people that, because what happens with gambling, when you're in the grips of gambling addiction, you kind of enter a trance where you're not in control. At that time, you're not in control. And what happens when you step out of being in that trance, and with gambling, and if you've racked up, and what I have done and other people have done, enormous amounts of debt, the waves of guilt, anxiety just come crashing at you, and that's when, of course, you know, the feelings of suicide feel like the only way out.
Thanks, Jake, for sharing your experience with us. I suppose I'll come to you, Ed Murray, professional gambler.
I find Jake's testimony very moving, very powerful. Gambling is complicated. We are built as human beings over a million years of evolution to behave in a certain way, and we're programmed in a certain way. And I think an example that's sometimes given is fishing, where you wait for hours, but you get an extreme feeling of joy when you catch a fish. And the same psychological bonus from that, achieving that, catching an animal to eat, is the same thing that we're experiencing each time we win a spin of roulette, something like that. It's channeled at that human psychological frailty that is in all of us. One thing that I would like to say from Jake's point, it's very powerful what he says. There should be some kind of maximum losses per day built into these websites. There should be, no account should let you lose 10, 20, 30,000 pounds in a day. There has to be responsible bookmaking and responsible gaming. There's a lot of issues. It's very complicated. I think there's an issue of freedom of choice. Most people who gamble rationally, and they choose to do so. There are people, as with alcohol, as with cigarettes, who there's forms of addiction, but most people, and at the margin, which is the important point, when gambling has grown, I think problem gambling is the same as it was, but there is more gambling going on than there was, because it is so easy. It's brought into people's homes. It's so much more accessible. There should be maximum losses per day. There should be protection. There should be something to stop all these offshore operators. We should have a tax revenue going to the government, because most of these companies are now offshore and advertising in the UK. There's an issue there where we'd like to keep hold of tax revenue in the economy. I think fixed odds betting terminals are awful. They're not a skill-based game. They're very parasitical. They line the high streets. They offer very few low-paid jobs to workers. Betting shops have become something where people used to go in and, you know, maybe bet on one horse race every 5 or 6 minutes and pick out, you know, some form. Try to have some skill if they could. These fixed odds betting terminals are rapid. They're quick. They're addictive. At first, they were very, very high stakes. There should be limits on the speed of spins and on the amount that you can stake on these games, so you can't have very, very, very quick blowouts. I think it's an industry in its infancy that needs more control.
I want to come to the panel's anthropologist, Professor Rebecca Cassidy from Goldsmiths University. Now, you're principal investigator of GAMSOC, which is a project which uses anthropological methods and theories to explore gambling in Europe. What harms can you see that gambling is doing to the UK and Europe as a whole?
I also would like to say with Ed how moving I found Jake's testimony. And I think that is one aspect of what's going on currently as the gambling environment changes so rapidly in ways that actually I'm not sure even the industry fully understands. Mark has done a follow-up of a secondary data analysis from some of the prevalence studies, which suggests that problem gambling rates among online gamblers are actually up to 5 times higher than they are among non-remote gamblers. And so I think that's an important point here. But I also, as an anthropologist, I'm interested in how disruptive technologies might also provide new kinds of gambling experiences. And so I wondered if we might also consider the move to mobile that we're currently observing. And in that case, I think the leading provider of mobile casino games in the UK has claimed that 85% of its customers don't have an existing account with a bookmaker. Now, what that suggests is we don't even know how these people are going to behave as they enter into this new world, this new set of anticipations, if you like, that revolves around playing casino games on mobile phones. And I'm not suggesting for a second that this is necessarily going to lead to more problems with gambling. I'm suggesting that we simply don't know. I think that if you look at something like the creation of the National Lottery in 1994, that was a big sea change in how the government views risky methods of generating profit, if you like. And by bringing gambling within its own remit, it became both regulator and commercial participant in that market. Since that time, as you said, we've had the Gambling Act in 2005, which has had a liberalising effect in practice. And we have had, since the 2001 change in taxation, a rise in FOBTs, as you've noticed. The change in taxation made small stake, high volume gambling profitable, as we all know. But the recent Select Committee suggested that more of those machines should be available in casinos rather than fewer, because casinos are so well regulated. So, the movement that we're discussing here is actually not entirely in one direction. I think the gambling, the state, if you like, shares the sense of John Whittingdale MP, who was chair of the Select Committee, in saying that gambling is now widely accepted in the UK as a legitimate entertainment activity. And this is something that's been achieved, as Mark will explain, through advertising and through an increased presence through the various media. And this is something that people like Jake and Ed may need to feed into and see what the real experience of gambling is actually like.
And before we return to you, Mark Griffiths, I want to introduce Peter Nolan to the discussion. You're a gambling consultant, founder and managing director of iGaming Solutions. You've had the benefit of hearing from everyone now in the panel on this discussion about gambling. What direction do you think gambling is going in the UK?
I think the point made just now regarding mobile, in terms of online, specifically mobile getting to be close to 50% in terms of the channel, will probably become more important than that. I think in terms of fixed odds betting, in play has grown in the last few years to be up to 50-60% of the total turnover. So there's been a move to see people betting more in live terms on sport, and also using other channels such as mobile and tablets. It's the biggest change from a technology point of view, I think.
And would you say you'd agree that you are a gambling consultant and you've worked with the huge companies who need to make decisions and implement changes to their betting shops and make them more profitable? Is that correct?
I did originally work for Ladbrokes, but I have worked online since 1998, really. So I have got some experience in retail, but not recent.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. I'm joined by anthropologist Professor Rebecca Cassidy from Goldsmiths University, gambling consultant Peter Nolan, Jake Brindell, a reformed gambling addict Ed Murray, who's a professional gambler, and Professor Mark Griffiths, Europe's only Professor of Gambling Studies. If your experience is with online, Professor Mark Griffiths, we can come to you next, because you highlighted that as the greatest problem.
The interesting thing is, Rebecca was saying about a piece of research that we published a few years ago using the British Gambling Prevalence Survey data, and we found that the rate of problem gambling amongst those who had gambled online was 10 times as high as those people who'd never gambled online. And the thing is, the press then, we had all these headlines saying internet gambling is 10 times more dangerous than offline gambling. And in fact, that isn't the case at all, because what we know from that data is that most people who gamble online also gamble offline as well. And in a way, we didn't have a good definition of what an online gambler is. Now, what's more interesting, we've just done some secondary analysis of the most recent British Gambling Prevalence Survey, and we split up gamblers into 4 different groups. We split them up between those who only gambled offline, those who only gambled online, those who gambled on lots of different activities, both online and offline, and whether they gambled, a 4th group who gambled on the same activities, both online and offline. And the most interesting thing we found was that amongst online gamblers only, we did not find a single problem gambler. That doesn't suggest that online is dangerous in and of itself. I think this comes back to something that Jake was saying earlier, and what you said yourself, is that if you are a problem gambler or you're someone who's vulnerable or susceptible, the online medium does become more dangerous for those types of people. But it does seem to be the case from the most recent analysis we've just done that the people who only gambled online, and they're often people like online poker players, know what they're doing, they lose very little money, and they tend to be young, educated, professional, managerial people, and don't seem to have any problems at all. But for those who are problem gamblers, and we know from the British Gambling Prevalence Survey that problem gamblers gamble on lots of different things, and they gamble on lots of different media, what it does mean, if you're a problem gambler, of course, where traditionally, if you went into a casino, the casino would only be open 12 hours a day, so there was another 12 hours you couldn't be gambling. Of course, with online gambling, mobile phone gambling, interactive television gambling, we're talking about an activity that you can theoretically do 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. And as Jake was saying, the kind of protective mechanisms that you tend to find in offline environments aren't necessarily there for online. But the good news about technology, and I work with lots of companies in terms of my consultancy capacity, the kind of measures that we were talking about, for instance, putting time and money limits in, the most socially responsible operators do that now. And you look at Camelot, for instance, you can set up, when you go and gamble online, you can set up how much you want to lose in a week or a month, how much time you want to spend. These, technology has enabled us to do this, but unfortunately only a very small minority of online gambling companies are using this technology.
Peter Nolan, gambling consultant, then just to come back to you, what consultancy methods do you use in terms of the socially responsible side to gambling websites?
I mean, I think it depends on what I'm consulting on, really, and to be honest, I haven't done much consultancy in the social and responsible gaming area. I mean, I was operations director for a major UK operator a few years ago, and as part of that, we had a very sort of proactive social and responsible gaming strategy involving using technology, involving providing tools for customers to self-help and to set their own limits. And we also had technology looking at identifying potential problem gambling behaviour in order to drive a sort of intervention, a proactive approach. As I say, there is, as we talked by Professor Mark Griffiths, there is technology, and there is bookmakers, especially in the UK, using technology proactively to identify problem gamblers or problem gambler behaviour. But it's difficult, I found, when talking to customers, to identify one person's behaviour is acceptable to them and another is a problem. It depends. There's a lack of information about customers' behaviour. It's very difficult to be completely certain about what customers' behaviour means in terms of the problem or not.
Thanks, Peter. Okay, I want to come to anthropologist Professor Rebecca Cassidy. You were shaking your head in disagreement to some of the things Peter Nolan was saying then. Can you tell us why?
I think I was wondering to myself whether and perhaps Mark might be able to enlighten us, because having worked with a number of these companies, I was thinking back to the Australian Productivity Commission, the 1998-1999 study that was repeated in 2010, which seemed to show that a disproportionate amount of revenue came from a small number of customers of slot machines, and in particular 42% of revenue came from people that the survey identified as problem gamblers. Now, I realise that that's on slot machines in Australia, and it's a vast leap to think that we might be able to use that to think about online gambling in the UK. But I'm simply raising the more general point as to whether business models of the kind that take a large proportion of revenue from a small proportion of customers are actually sustainable, and whether you can then put problem gambling measures in place without making undermining those business models, if you like, because I think Mark would be the first to say that many operators are actually able to identify people that they would consider to have a problem with gambling.
We've heard quite a lot from Mark Griffiths, as much as I'd like to hear more from all of you, but I do have to keep an eye on the time. So I'm going to come to Jake Brindell now, our reformed gambling addict who's here with us. You were nodding in agreement to Professor Cassidy there.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. It's a point that I keep banging on every time I get a chance in the media to say that, because we're always getting this wheeled out by the government, the Gambling Commission, the industry, saying that it's the 1% or less who have a problem. Accepted, true, I'll go along with that. But basic maths tells you that by the fact of them being problem gamblers, they're going to rack up many more percentage points in terms of revenue. And yeah, the figure I had was 33% from the 1999 Australian Productivity Commission report. Again, Mark can maybe correct us or help us out on this one. I don't know of any other report that has tried to answer this question, but common sense tells us that they're racking up huge amounts of revenue. Plus, I've got experience on the shop floor. When I grew up in all the arcades, in all the bookmakers, the casinos, it's the same faces, the same people handing over large sums of money, getting very angry, getting very anxious, and in some cases violent and total despair. That's been my experience over the last 30 years in all the betting establishments that I've ever been to. Okay, we've got the technology to ramp things up. We've got the technology to increase these profits. Well, come on, we've got the technology to do those things. Let's back it up with an infrastructure. Let's introduce a 1% gambling levy on all industry's profits, and let's funnel that money back in for treatment, prevention, research and education. I'm all for individual choice, I'm all for gambling, but what I am for is for an infrastructure to help those that fall prey.
Professor Mark Griffiths, I'd like you to respond to that.
Well, I totally agree with Jake. I've argued for many years that I would like a statutory levy. At the moment, the industry contributes their aim is to contribute £5 million a year from industry profits to help towards education, prevention, treatment and research. £5 million is a drop in the ocean. In Australia, New Zealand, Canada, some of the provinces, etc., they've introduced statutory levies, and that would generate millions and millions of pounds that could be fed back into helping treatment, problem gamblers in terms of treatment, put into the NHS, in terms of research and education prevention. Nearly all the money that is raised from the industry at the moment through these funds does go into treatment, which is obviously very important. But like you say, relatively we know very little about gambling as compared with other addictive behaviours like alcohol, for instance. And obviously, as a researcher myself, I would be saying that more money should be needed for research, but we certainly need more money for education.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and I'm joined by Professor Mark Griffiths, Europe's only Professor of Gambling Studies, anthropologist Professor Rebecca Cassidy from Goldsmiths University, gambling consultant Peter Nolan, Jake Brindell, a reformed gambling addict, and Ed Murray, who's a professional gambler. Ed Murray, our resident professional gambler here, you've been furiously writing away there on your piece of paper. Can you tell us what you've been scribbling?
Just a few points. Professor Cassidy was worried about undermining the business models of the PLCs, these powerful companies that run gambling in this country. I'd have no problem with that. If it's a business, there's heavy restrictions on drugs, on nuclear waste. There's so many examples where if it's producing a negative externality that's harmful to society, that's not taking place in the actual transaction, making a profit but not paying for the damage is not acceptable. There should be heavy tax to bring into line the real cost of these transactions, which are, in this case, gambling transactions. I don't think that fixed odds betting terminals, bringing a casino into every single high street, has a place in this country. I'd like to respond to Jake as well. There's the suggestion of taxation. We have two problems here. In the National Lottery is played heavily by the poorest part of society. So when you're taxing, the money spent on lottery tickets is predominantly a tax on relatively poor people. It's a regressive tax. So if you're raising this tax, you're again raising money from the poorest sections of society. And what we need is fixed limits and cool down periods and stuff. We're at the cutting edge of a new... exciting is the wrong words, but we don't know where we're going. It's all groundbreaking. All this mobile technology. these companies are under pressure from their shareholders to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible. And I don't think the taxation scheme quite works, especially as many of the firms are offshore, so how would they be regulated? Lots of problems there.
OK, finally from you, Peter Nolan, what's your response, having heard again from the suggestions from Professor Griffiths and Jake Brindell on what they would do, and Ed Murray himself as to regulation and taxation and social corporate responsibility?
These businesses are regulated and licensed and being run properly. Certainly the ones in the ones I'm aware of, they spend time and effort on responsible gambling. No one that I've ever met in the business wants to make money from problem gamblers. No one goes out to do so, as far as I'm aware and I've come across. So, yeah, I think in terms of more money being put into education and dealing with problem gamblers, yes, why, of course. And I think as the business has increased in the UK, which is a competitive marketplace, hence all the advertising, it's reasonable for that money to increase as well. It's important to remember that the 1% has been talked about in terms of prevalence of problem gambling is low compared with the global figure, and I think some of the sort of recent stories, for example, on FOBTs are basically press on misunderstanding some of the facts or so-called facts that are being provided by people with...
We'll end there with Peter's point then that the press have got it wrong about the fixed odds betting terminals and them not perhaps being so much of a problem. Finally, from you, Professor Mark Griffiths.
Whatever we do, the industry are always 2 steps ahead of everything. I think technology has a fantastic contribution to make in terms of helping us deal with problem gamblers, but I think technology at the end is always used at the end of the day for making profits. And the researchers, the legislators, social policy makers, we always seem to be 2 steps behind what's happening with the gambling industry. Gambling is now a socially acceptable leisure activity. People do it, but we do need to put in policies, protections and protocols to help those people who are at risk of becoming problem gamblers, and also for those who are problem gamblers already.
Thanks, Professor Griffiths. Finally from you, Ed Murray.
I'd just like to balance out. Gambling does provide many jobs in the high street and in casinos, which do employ quite a lot of people. There are positives to the industry. I think what we're raising today is that there's ways that it can be better policed and better governed. I'd just like to respond to Peter's point that he says 1% is not a problem of 600,000 problem gamblers in this country. If there's 600,000 problem gamblers, they all have families, they all have kids. This is people's lives. It's not much to ask for the gambling industry to, in return for making quite large profits, to behave as responsibly as possible, especially when we're at the cutting edge of technology and breaking new ground.
Thanks, Ed. And finally, Jake Brindell, I'll give you the final word.
Let's not forget where this money comes from. If we're talking about a problem segment of society, this is coming from their mortgage payments, this is coming from their rent, their child's food, holidays, all of that. I never had a bed until I was 36 years old because I used money for funds to gamble. I was living on a mattress and I somehow reasoned that away as if that was the right thing to do. So I would just say for specifically people who sit tight or closer with the gambling industry, come on, stand up, buck up. Let's put your money where your mouth is. Let's get this 1% levy.
I'd like to thank all my guests, Professor Rebecca Cassidy from Goldsmiths University, Ed Murray, who's a professional gambler, gambling consultant, Peter Nolan, who's the founder and managing director of iGaming Solutions, and Professor Mark Griffiths, chartered psychologist and Europe's only professor of gambling studies at Nottingham Trent University, and finally Jake Brindell, who's a reformed gambling addict.